It was a season of chilling winds and early frosts when I moved into the old Whitmore cottage on the edge of Ashwood. The locals, a tight-knit community, had few stories about the house, only that it was old and had been unoccupied for years. Eager to start anew after a tumultuous year, I brushed aside their hesitations and settled into my new home. The cottage was quaint, draped in climbing ivy and surrounded by an untamed garden. Its interior was a mix of ancient wood and stone, with heavy furniture that spoke of decades past. Despite its charm, there was a lingering coldness in the air that no fire could dispel. My first few nights were uneventful, save for the occasional creaks and groans typical of old houses. However, on the fifth night, a sharp knocking jolted me awake. Glancing at the clock, it read a few minutes past midnight. The sound didn't repeat, and thinking it was perhaps a branch against the window, I drifted back to sleep. The following night, the knocking returned, clearer and more insistent. This time I rose, my heart pounding as I tiptoed through the cold, dark house. As I approached the front door, the knocking ceased. Peering through the peephole, I saw only the swirling fog that had settled over Ashwood. Unease prickling my skin, I returned to bed, unease settling like a stone in my stomach. On the third night, the knocking grew frantic. Determined to confront whatever or whoever was disturbing my peace, I waited by the door as the clock neared midnight. The air grew colder, and my breath misted in the dimly lit hallway. As expected, the knocking started, quick and sharp. I flung the door open, but to my dismay, there was nobody there. Just the empty, fog-filled night and the quiet of an undisturbed village. Disturbed by the events, I mentioned them to Eleanor, an elderly neighbor, while fetching my mail. She paled under her rosy cheeks, a hand flying to her mouth. "Oh dear, you've been hearing it too," she whispered. I nodded, confused and anxious for any explanation. "It's old Thomas Whitmore's doing," she said after a pause, her voice a tremulous whisper. "Lived in your cottage, he did, many years ago. Disappeared one night. Some say he was taken by the fog, others believe worse. But he knocks, always at midnight, looking for someone to let him back in." Her story chilled me to the bone, but part of me refused to believe such ghostly tales. That night, however, the knocking changed everything. As midnight approached, the familiar dread filled me. The knocking began, but this time I ignored it, pulling the blanket over my head. But then, a new sound, a soft, mournful wail, like someone in deep despair. My heart raced as I reluctantly approached the door, driven by a mix of fear and pity. This time, when I opened the door, I was met by a sight I'll never forget. A figure stood in the fog, barely discernible but unmistakably human, dressed in outdated garb, his features obscured. He raised a hand as if beckoning me. Frozen, I stood there, staring as he slowly faded into the mist, the wailing ceasing with his departure. The air suddenly warmed, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving behind a silence that was almost reverential. Sleep eluded me that night. By morning, my resolve was clear. I could not stay, knowing what lingered at the door. I packed my essentials and left the cottage as the sun rose, the horizon clear for the first time since my arrival. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the road. But there was only the empty path and the quiet cottage, looking as serene as the day I arrived. To this day, I believe Thomas Whitmore is still there, waiting in the eternal fog, knocking at the stroke of midnight, looking for someone to let him in. The memory of that night lingers, a haunting reminder that some doors, once opened, might reveal things that cannot be unseen.